If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, today we have Sonia interviewing John about natural morality. We are continuing from the previous episode today. We hope you enjoy.
Now, let's continue. He also says, I often tell my students, I'll say if someone tells you there's no such thing as right and wrong, cut in front of them in line. What are they going to say? That's not fair. That's not right. As if there's really an objective standard we're both accountable to. Now, we saw the same kind of thing in the Dr. Craig video. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I think he's upset that you cut in front of him in line. That's not fair. That's not right. But if he had a chance to cut in front of you in line, then he might not say that, or he might not care.
Indeed, he might not care. In addition to that, here's the thing. This is supposed to be an argument for the existence of God. If you're arguing for the existence of God, you're arguing against people who don't believe there's a God at all. So these are people who would be atheists who would hold to a naturalistic view of a life. They would believe in the theory of evolution, for example. And you'd have to convince them that morality is more in keeping with the concept of a God than would develop naturally. Now, they will point out, for example, in this matter, if you look at a lion, it's just killed a zebra or something, it's eating it. Well, if a hyena comes along and tries to grab it, the lion will go after that hyena. He will not let the hyena essentially cut in front of him, will he? And it's not being done from any kind of higher moral standard. It's not because the lion understands that, hey, there's objective morals here. It's not right for the hyena to cut in front and take my food. Absolutely not. It's just obviously an evolved development that the lion wants his food and needs food to live and will not allow others to take from him. So the fact that people complain if somebody takes something from them or cuts in front of in a line for them, if they complain, that's absolutely not proof that he believes in an objective standard we're both accountable to, nor would it be a proof that there is such an objective standard, even if he believed it. Now, McDowell goes on to say this. The other thing C.S. Lewis points out in his book, The Abolition of Man, is that across cultures, universally, throughout history, there are certain moral truths that people are committed to. Things like courage, things like faithfulness, mercy, caring for posterity. Now, the practice of these moral principles may vary, he says, but there are universal moral truths that people are committed to. What do you think? Is this a good argument?
Well, mercy definitely wouldn't be on that list, but even for things that could possibly be on the list, they're things that you might need for the society to survive, and that would explain why they're across cultures, not because everyone believes they're right. Like courage, I suppose, if you have to fight to keep your country intact from invaders, that's something that applies to every country, theoretically. Although, if you look at it, there are some cultures that have people with courage and others that don't, even with that. So it's just not true.
Yes, I have to agree with you on that. It's not true. This is a claim that Lewis made and is often made after him. But when you look at the facts, you don't find that at all. Consider something like murder, because murder is usually brought up as one of these universal truths. Every human society is against murder. But here's the question. How do you define murder? Unauthorized, unlawful killing. And yes, in our society, we're against murder. Murder of anybody. In theory, anyway.
Well, except the unborn children.
Except the unborn children. So it's already difficult to argue that everybody knows murder is wrong. But when you compare societies, there are societies like ours where killing anybody without proper justification was wrong. But in many, perhaps most cultures, there were strictures against killing people in the community. But there were no strictures against killing people outside the community. Quite the opposite. It was often seen as a good thing. They're competitors for your resources. You will go and make war on them. You will kill them and take their goodies. And so even on these fundamental things, they say it's very strong strictures against adultery, for example. Well, yes, again, because if you're living in a society where the perpetuation of society is based on creating and raising a next generation, you're not going to put in the time and effort to raise a child unless you're sure he's yours. What you find as you look through these values, not surprisingly, the ones that are universal, supposedly universal, are the very ones that are necessary for people to live in community. Ever since the earliest days, it was necessary to live in community. Groups of people can do things that one lone individual cannot. If you look back at, say, ancient Mesopotamia, where the first recorded civilization developed, the one from which Abraham came, this was a land that was flat, hot, swampy, with no timber, very little building stone. And so to have a city there, you needed to build walls, build dwellings, all out of mud bricks. You needed irrigation ditches to grow crops. And these are not things individuals could do. It was necessary for people to live in community, and to do that, there are certain values that they have to hold on to. And if we see these values being the universal ones, but not the other ones, then it becomes a very difficult thing to argue that these are there because everybody knows they're right. On things that are not essential to survive as a community, societies actually had very, very different views. What about marriage? Monogamy versus polygamy. The role of women. What kind of rights do women have? Human sacrifice. There are many societies that practice human sacrifice. The Aztecs, for example, would take human victims up to the top of their flat pyramids and plunge a flint knife into their chests and rip out their still beating hearts. They obviously thought this was right. They didn't do that thinking this was wrong. They thought it was right. What about the issue of slavery? There was a time when every single society in the world thought it was right. They practiced it. Apparently, even slaves had no belief that this was objectively wrong. They didn't like being slaves, but they didn't think the institution was wrong. Now, does everybody think it's wrong? No, there's still countries and still cultures that practice slavery. We in the West, of course, are sure that it's wrong. And it's interesting, as we saw before, that the Dr. Craig video mentioned racial discrimination. Well, there was a lot of that. Society, at first, almost all of them thought it was right. And then people became convinced that it's not, and you ended up fighting a civil war over it. And now everybody thinks it's wrong. But that then raises the question, if they're objective moral values, do they change through time? And if they do, are they objective? When everybody knew that slavery was right, was it right? Now that everybody knows it's wrong, has it become wrong? Was it wrong all the time? It becomes very, very difficult when you do compare cultures across the world and across time to argue that any sort of shared values is proof that there's objective morality. Any comments on that?
Oh, I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, let's listen to another apologist then, Dr. Frank Turek. Let's listen to him try to make the case for objective morality.
This is the start of the recording from the YouTube video.
Yeah, excellent question, Marcus. Let's just use the Nazi culture against the Allied culture back in World War II. The Nazis thought it was fine to kill Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, these kinds of people, because they wanted to create the super race. We look at that and go, well, that's wrong. And so in order for us to convict the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial, we said to them, you shouldn't have done that. And they said, we were following the orders of our government. And we came back and said, you had a moral obligation to disobey an immoral law. Why? Because there's a moral law, international law, what Thomas Jefferson called in the Declaration of Independence nature's law, what the Apostle Paul calls the law written on the heart in Romans chapter 2. That law is God's nature. And the only way to adjudicate between these two laws, say the Allied culture and the Nazi culture, was to say that the Allied culture was closer to this law than the Nazi culture. So when we say that there's got to be a standard beyond, we're not implying that everybody's necessarily going to agree with that standard, or we're not implying that everybody's going to behave according to that standard. But what we are saying is we can identify when a culture goes wrong because they deviate from the standard of God's nature. So the moral law or the moral argument doesn't depend on everybody being moral. It doesn't even depend on everybody agreeing what is moral. All the moral law is saying is if there's one thing morally right out there and one thing morally wrong, there has to be a God. So if it's wrong, say, to torture babies for fun, God exists. If it's right to love babies, God exists.
This is the end of the recording from the YouTube video.
All right, so now you see Turek's approach, and he uses the Nazi culture against the Allied culture back in World War II. What did you think of his argument here?
Well, he basically seems to imply the Allies have the right to say the Nazis are wrong because the Allied law is closer to the natural law than the Nazis' law. But you could also look at it as the Allies won the war, so then they can dictate the terms to the Nazis.
Ah, good observation. Exactly. He says, in order for us to convict the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial, we said to them, you shouldn't have done that. And when they said we were just following orders, we said they had a moral obligation to disobey immoral laws. It reminds me of a scene from Shogun. Did you ever read the book Shogun by James Clavell or see the mini-series back from, I think, 1981 with Richard Chamberlain in the starring role?
No, I haven't.
Chamberlain plays an English ship captain, a pilot, who gets shipwrecked with his men in Japan in the year 1600. And he's in trouble, obviously. Japanese are hostile. He can't speak their language. They can't speak his. There are Jesuit missionaries there, Spanish Jesuit missionaries who could act as translators. The problem is that the Spanish and the English are mortal enemies at this point. They're already mortal enemies over the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588. But now the Protestant Netherlands has risen up in revolt against their overlords, the Spanish Catholic Spain, and England has been helping them. Nevertheless, Chamberlain plays the character John Blackthorne. He's called Anjin, or Anjin-san by the Japanese. He has to rely on them to translate fairly. And he's brought before the local warlord, Toranaga, and he's being interviewed. And the Jesuit is translating accurately, but he knows what to pick and choose to make Blackthorne look bad. And at one point, the translator mentions to Toranaga that the English are helping the Dutch against their proper overlords.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.